He wasn't supposed to be there. At least, that's what they told him. A quiet man, walking through a place that called itself equal, yet treated him like a trespasser in his own world. One moment, he was invisible. The next, he became the center of a storm he never asked for. What began as a routine day soon turned into a test of dignity, justice, and survival. Because sometimes the greatest danger isn't what's done in the dark. It's what happens in plain sight. If he had known how far they'd go to silence him, he might have never stepped forward, but by then, it was already too late. It started like any other morning. Marcus Johnson, a 29-year-old mechanic, grabbed his coffee, kissed his mother on the cheek, and headed out the door. He was the kind of man who fixed everyone's problems but rarely spoke about his own. In his small southern town, Marcus was known for his quiet smile, his steady hands, and his habit of helping anyone stranded on the road. To him, hard work was survival, not pride. He kept his head down, avoided trouble, and believed that staying silent was safer than being right. But beneath that calm routine, the world around him was shifting, whispers growing louder, eyes watching longer. That morning, something felt off. The same neighbors who once waved now turned away, and the police cruiser parked across the street didn't move, not even after he drove off. Marcus didn't know it yet, but his simple drive to work was about to collide with a system that saw his skin before his soul. He thought he was just going to fix a car, but what waited for him down that road would shatter everything he thought he knew about fairness, freedom, and fear. Marcus's morning turned uneasy the moment he pulled into the parking lot of the auto shop. 2 patrol cars were already there, engines idling, lights off but presence unmistakable. He thought maybe there'd been a break-in, until one of the officers pointed at him. That's the guy. 3 words that turned a quiet day into a nightmare. Marcus's heart pounded as the officers approached, hands resting on their holsters. They asked for ID before explaining why, their tone sharp, rehearsed, and heavy with suspicion. A local woman had reported a suspicious black man trying to break into her car. Marcus looked down at the keys still in his hand, the same keys he'd used to open the shop for years. He tried to explain, voice calm but trembling, that he worked there, that he fixed that very woman's car last week. But the truth didn't seem to matter. Their eyes had already made their decision. They cuffed him right there in front of co-workers and customers, pressing his face against the hood of a car he repaired the night before. Every word he said seemed to make things worse. His co-workers hesitated. Some stepped back. Others filmed quietly but said nothing. To them, speaking up might risk their own safety. Marcus felt the weight of silence heavier than the metal on his wrists. At the station, he sat in a cold room under flickering lights, questions hurled at him like accusations. Where were you this morning? Who do you work for? Why were you near that car? Over and over, the same words, the same disbelief. He showed them his ID, his work badge, even his employee login, but they just exchanged looks, smirks that told him none of it mattered. Hours passed. He missed calls from his mother, who was waiting for him to bring lunch like he always did. Outside, rumors spread that Marcus had been caught stealing, a lie born faster than truth could travel. By the time his boss arrived to confirm his innocence, the damage was done. The whispers had already turned into headlines. Local mechanic detained in vehicle theft investigation. No correction followed. When Marcus finally walked out, the town didn't look the same anymore. People stared longer. Some avoided him. Some muttered things under their breath that hurt more than the cuffs ever did. Nights became restless. Sirens made his chest tighten. He kept seeing the officers smirk, hearing the disbelief in their voices, feeling the cold steel against his skin. But worse than the fear was the anger, the quiet, buried kind that burned slow. The realization that no matter how hard he worked, one false assumption could erase his dignity in an instant. The system wasn't broken. It was working exactly as designed. Yet Marcus refused to disappear. He began collecting evidence, contacting local reporters, demanding the body cam footage that could clear his name. But when the footage conveniently malfunctioned, the truth became harder to prove. Friends warned him to let it go. His mother begged him to stay quiet, terrified of what might happen next. But Marcus couldn't. Not anymore. What began as humiliation had become a fight for something bigger than pride. It was a fight for existence, for the right to be seen as human. He stood in front of that same auto shop one morning, watching the sun rise over the same parking lot where everything changed. Only this time, he wasn't alone. Cameras rolled, voices joined his, and the silence that once protected the powerful began to crack. But what Marcus didn't know was that his stand for justice was about to push the very people who wronged him into a corner. And cornered systems don't go quietly. What happened next would test not just his courage, but his faith in humanity itself. The morning of the rally arrived under a gray, heavy sky. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, clutching a folder of evidence that proved everything: his innocence, the officers' lies, the missing footage. Cameras lined the streets, reporters waiting for a soundbite, for a spectacle. His voice trembled as he began to speak, not from fear, but from the weight of a truth too long ignored. He spoke about the humiliation, the silence, the fear that followed him home every night since that day. He spoke for every person who had ever been accused before being heard. The crowd listened, some cheering, others uneasy. Among them stood the same officers who had arrested him, faces cold, eyes sharp. Then, suddenly, chaos. A protester shouted, someone shoved, and within seconds, sirens blared. One officer grabbed Marcus by the arm, twisting it behind his back as the cameras rolled. "You're resisting," he barked, even as Marcus stood still, refusing to struggle. The air filled with shouting, flashing lights, and the metallic scent of panic. The world slowed to a crawl. The officer's hand hovered near his holster. The crowd's cries turned into distant echoes. And for one horrifying second, Marcus saw how easily this could end. A single twitch, a moment of fear, and he'd be another name in a long, tragic list. But then, something changed. Dozens of phones lifted, recording everything. Reporters shouted his name. "We're watching," someone screamed. The officers froze, realizing the whole world was witnessing what they tried to hide. The truth, once buried, now at eyes. Marcus stood tall despite the pain, his voice breaking but unyielding. "You can't silence what everyone can see." The tension cracked like lightning, and for the first time, the power shifted, not through violence, but through visibility. As the crowd erupted around him, Marcus felt both the terror of exposure and the spark of something unstoppable. But what came next would prove whether light was enough to overcome the shadows that had ruled for so long, or if those shadows would strike back harder than ever. When the dust finally settled, Marcus was free, but not the same. The charges were quietly dropped after the footage went viral, revealing every second of the horror he'd endured. Millions watched as the story unfolded across screens worldwide, sparking outrage, protests, and yet another wave of conversations about race and justice. The city issued a formal apology, calling it a misunderstanding. The officers involved were placed on administrative leave, their faces hidden behind vague press statements. For some, that was closure, but Marcus knew better. Freedom didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival, and survival came with a cost. In the days that followed, Marcus couldn't escape the images replaying in his mind. The blinding flash of police lights, the cold pavement beneath his face, the sound of fear in his own breath. Every siren that echoed through his neighborhood made his heart race. Every time he stepped outside, he felt eyes on him, judging, waiting, assuming. He tried to return to work, but things weren't the same. Some people avoided him, afraid his presence meant trouble. Others looked at him like a symbol, not a man. And while the world debated hashtags and headlines, Marcus was left trying to rebuild the pieces of a life that had been shattered in seconds. But amidst the fear came something unexpected: voices. Thousands of people who saw their own reflection in his pain began to speak. Messages poured in from across the country. Mothers who had lost sons, fathers who feared for their children, and strangers who simply said, "We see you." Marcus realized that his story wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who had ever been silenced, profiled, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. And so, instead of hiding, he began to speak. He shared his story in schools, community centers, churches. His voice trembled at first, but every time he spoke, more people listened. News stations began covering his journey not as a scandal, but as a statement. The footage that had once shown as humiliation was now being used in workshops about racial bias and police accountability. Local leaders who had once ignored issues of injustice suddenly wanted to meet with him. But Marcus stayed grounded, reminding everyone that what happened to him wasn't unique. It was systemic. You don't fix this, he'd say, by punishing one man. You fix it by changing what made it possible in the first place. His courage became a spark. Students started organizing peaceful marches. Churches held vigils. Neighborhoods that had been divided by fear began to really talk, for the first time in years. Yet behind his calm voice, Marcus still carried the invisible scars. Nights were the hardest. He'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, feeling both gratitude and grief. Gratitude for being alive. Grief for knowing others never got that chance. He often thought of names, George, Brianna, Tamir, names he used to see in headlines, now etched in his heart. He understood now how pain could become purpose, how silence could be turned into strength. But he also knew how exhausting it was to carry the weight of an entire movement on his back when all he ever wanted was to live quietly, safely, and free. Months passed, and slowly, small changes began to ripple outward. The city implemented new police training programs. Officers were required to wear body cameras at all times. Community liaisons were appointed to mediate racial disputes. It wasn't everything, but it was something, and Marcus watched it happen with cautious hope, knowing progress often came slow, and justice even slower. Still, the moment he saw a young boy holding a sign that read, "Because of Marcus, I'm not afraid anymore," he broke down. For the first time since that terrible night, his tears weren't from fear, they were from faith. Faith that maybe, just maybe, the world was beginning to listen. But even in that fragile hope, Marcus understood the truth. One man's survival wasn't enough to end centuries of inequality. His story was a ripple, not a revolution. Real change required everyone, every voice, every heart, to confront the uncomfortable, to stop looking away, to stop just sharing stories and start changing systems. Because racism isn't just what's done in the dark, it's what's ignored in the light. Marcus' life would never be the same. His name became a symbol of both pain and perseverance, a reminder of how easily a life can be broken and how powerful it can be when rebuilt with purpose. And as he stood one evening, watching the sunset fade behind the city skyline, he whispered the words he wished someone had told him long ago. I matter. We all do. This isn't just Marcus's story. It's ours. It's the story of every person who's been told to stay quiet, to move on, to forgive and forget. But some wounds demand remembrance. Some stories demand to be told again and again until change finally arrives. So the question remains, how many more lives have to break before equality stops being a promise on paper and becomes a reality we all live in? The fight against racism doesn't end when one man walks free. It begins when we all refuse to stay silent.